Well, that was an eventful regular season. We recap the highs and the lows of the 2022-2023 regular season today on Locked on Wild.
You're Locked on Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Locked on Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day and part of your daily routine. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any of our episodes throughout the week, especially with the postseason coming on Monday. On today's episode of Locked on Wild, we recap an eventful 2022-2023 regular season. We'll talk about some of the highs and some of the lows and what we've learned about the Wild as the postseason gets underway next week. My name is Seth Topal, your daily Minnesota Wild insider, and boy, did we run the gambit here during this regular season. A season in which the Wild took a little time to get acclimated to the non-scoring portion of the hockey world. A season that featured some goal droughts, but also some dominant goalie performances and still plenty of fun along the way. So we're going to go through and discuss all of those particulars. We'll start with the lows. We'll end on a high note, and we'll kind of shift our focus towards the postseason as well here today. So obviously, a few of the things that were low points to this season, you don't have to go very far in. 0-3 start, 20 goals allowed for the Minnesota Wild in their first three games. It started off with a 7-3 loss to the New York Rangers, a 7-6 loss to the LA Kings, and a 6-3 loss to the Colorado Avalanche. The Wild, one of the few teams that were winless to that point in the season. And it featured bad goaltending, bad defensive structure, and just a lot of players getting lost in particular portions of the ice. Now, obviously, the Wild rebounded after that, but it was such a bizarre start to the season and just completely uncharacteristic to what we have seen from this team in the past. And so, with the fact that it was the start of the year, I think that makes it even a little worse. But definitely low point, or one of the low points in the season, was the 0-3 start. And it took the Wild a while to get any sort of traction as they went pretty much all the way through the month of November, barely above 500. They were 10-9-2 going into November 27th. The month of December saw the Wild really start to pick things back up. But obviously, you start things in an 0-3 hole, it's going to take you a little while to dig out of that. Some of the other lows for this season included the amount of injuries that the Wild had to deal with at points throughout the season. Obviously, recently, Kirill Kaprizov getting hurt. That was a big blow that the team was able to weather pretty well. But Joel Eriksson Ek out going into the postseason is a huge concern. The Wild missed Jonas Brodin for a good stretch of time. Brandon Duhaime, Marcus Foligno, Jordan Greenway before he was traded missed some time as well. And so there were a lot of injuries that the Wild had to deal with here this season as well. Thankfully, they had more than a few players that were able to step in and fill voids. But that's not always the case. It's not always the case that you have players that are going to be able to step up and to fill those spots. You also have the season ender for Mason Shaw as one of those other injuries that that is going to be a tough one for this team to overcome come postseason time. So a handful of injuries. Obviously, the Shaw season ender is an unfortunate one. But it's just part of this regular grind of the season. Just felt like there were some pretty critical injuries that the Wild had to find a way to weather this season. Another one of the low points, there were a couple of stretches for the Wild in which goals were, well, just plain hard to find. Let's go back to the month of October. The Wild beats the Montreal Canadiens 4-1 on November 1st. In the next handful of games, they lost 4-0, lost 1-0, won 4-1, then 1-0, then lost 3-2 in a shootout and 2-1 in a shootout. And obviously there's going to be an adjustment period with a player like Kevin Fiala no longer on the roster, a team that last year scored 310 goals counting shootouts. Now this year, substantially less than that, as they finished the regular season with a total of 246. So you take out the shootout goals, 305 last year, 239 this year. So you're talking about a 66 goal drop in what the Wilds were able to score this year. That's a large drop for this team, and coupling the loss of Kevin Fiala with some substantial regression from a few key players in the goals department. You had Marcus Foligno, who scored over 20 goals last year. Did not get to that mark this year. Ryan Hartman scored 35. He did not get to that mark this year. And so that's the worst case scenario, is that you have players that are not able to replicate those career seasons. And it was probably a tall ask for those guys to be able to do it anyway. But you couple those factors together, and 66 goals lost, that's a lot. That's a lot of goals that came off the board from last year to this year. So that definitely factors in as one of the low points as well. And I'll throw another one in. And if you have any other low points that I am missing, feel free to drop them in the comments here on YouTube, because obviously there's a lot that happens throughout the course of a regular season. And so if there was anything else that you considered a low point for the Wild this year, drop it in the comments. We want to make sure that we get to everything here as we gear up for the postseason. Low point as well is the way that this Wild team went into the postseason. Obviously, they beat the Colorado Avalanche near the end of the season to take first place outright in the standings. That was back on March 29th. But after that, losing 2 games to the Vegas Golden Knights, losing to the Pittsburgh Penguins, and then losing to Winnipeg and Nashville to finish off the season, a 2-3-2 stretch after holding first place outright in the Central Division. And I know there are factors at play here, especially Joel Eriksson's injury, that led to the team focusing more on getting healthy and making sure that they didn't suffer any other catastrophic injuries going into the postseason. I get that. Still, the fact that the Wild were right there to potentially hoist the division crown, I'm still going to include that in the low points of the season. So you got a lot of injuries, you got a lot of scoring regression, lack of goal scoring, and of course there were plenty of low stretches as well. Again, 2-3-2 to end the season. You look at the month of January, midway through the month of January to midway through the month of February was not great for the Minnesota Wild. So just like with any other team, you have the ebbs and flows of the season that lead to some lows, but also lead to some highs. And so to continue today's episode of Locked On Wild, we will discuss some of those highs this season, which included the emergence of some unknowns and the continued rise of a couple of prominent names. We'll talk about all that as we continue today's episode of Locked on Wild after this. For a championship team, it's all about making sure every player is a perfect fit. It's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure every part you need fits right the first time around. Just add your ride to My Garage and look for the green check to know the part you need will fit or your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop on eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. Continuing today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, thanks for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Also part of your daily routine. Continuing to look at the highs and the lows of the 2022-2023 regular season. So we talked about the lows. Let's talk about the highs, which include a couple of emergences that were not necessarily expected here this season. We'll start, of course, with Filip Gustavsson. What a revelation Gustavsson was in net throughout the course of the season. And that's not to say Marc-Andre Fleury wasn't good either. It's just Gustavsson was the steadying factor for this team throughout the course of the year. He came in, was a little bit of a raw prospect. He had some starts at the NHL level, but not a ton to work off of, and just completely rewrote his career highs in basically every goalie category that you can have. Finished the season with 22 wins. He had a goals against average of 2.10. He had a save percentage of .931, and his previous career highs coming into the season: 16 games started, a goals against average. He had a goals against average of 2.16, but that was 2 years ago, and that only was in 7 starts. And so just took the ball and rolled with it. He had 3 shutouts on the season. He finished as one of the top statistical goalies in the entire NHL, something the Wild have not had since prime Dubnyk. So just a sensational season for Filip Gustavsson, and this Wild team needed it. This was a team that struggled to score goals at points throughout the season, and so they needed goalie play to keep them in it until they were able to find the back of the net. Filip Gustavsson did that and then some for a large majority of the regular season. Looks like he's going to get rewarded with a start in Game 1, which would be a fantastic way to reward him for his consistency, his calming presence in the net, and for what he was able to do to help this team get to where they wanted, which was, once again, the postseason. Not only did you have Filip Gustavsson's emergence, but how about the season that Matt Boldy had here this year? It was up until Kirill Kaprizov got injured that we were talking about Boldy having a little bit of a down year, to say the least. He was expected to finish the season with somewhere around 20 goals, which would have been way below what the hope was for him entering his second season in the NHL. And then once Kaprizov came out of the lineup, Matt Boldy really kicked it into high gear with what he was able to do. He just torched the month of March and finished the season with 63 points in 81 games. And just the performance just speaks for itself. 12 goals, 17 assists in the month of March, and then finished April with 3 more goals in 6 games. So just had a sensational end to the season, and looks to be a young player that this team's going to build around going forward. So we've seen the ability for him to take games over, which is something that this franchise definitely could use as a complement to what Kirill Kaprizov brings on the ice. And so you have those two guys as the most driving catalysts for career emergences this season. But let's not forget some of the other names that had very, very good seasons this year as well. You've got Joel Eriksson-Ek, who continued a trend for him. He had a career high in points and wasn't able to quite get to his career high in goals, but obviously with getting injured, that took some games away from him. But Eriksson-Ek with a career high in points, Freddie Gaudreau with a career high in goals with 19 on the season. You had Sam Steele, who registered a career high in goals and points, despite being a guy that bounced around in the lineup, and just continued excellence from the likes of Jared Spurgeon, who had 11 goals himself. So you had a lot of guys finding new ways to emerge and to help this team out when other pieces of the lineup were struggling to hold up their end of the bargain. So emergences, and let's not forget too that if not for Kirill Kaprizov getting hurt, he was probably knocking on the door of a 50-goal season. And so the fact that he still finished the year with 40 despite missing a handful of games, he finished with 67 games. Let's not discount the fact that Kirill could have hit the 50 burger here this season with how he was playing, especially as the season went on. So emergences, we saw this team really find its identity too in playing some really, really exciting games against some of the top teams in the NHL. One of the games that comes to mind for me, of course, is that matchup against the New Jersey Devils, in which Matt Boldy scored as time was winding out in overtime. That was just a sensational matchup on the road, no doubt, against the New Jersey Devils, 2-1. The score in that one. Let's not forget the win against the Colorado Avalanche on March 29th, in which the Wild took first place in the division outright at that point by jumping out to an early lead and just flustering the Colorado Avalanche in that game. But they played some other teams really, really tough in key spots as well. Going to Toronto on February 4th, this was a Filip Gustavsson start. They went to Toronto on the 24th of February, ended up losing that game 2-1 in overtime. But the Maple Leafs, one of the more difficult teams to play against, especially at home, especially in Toronto. And the Wild went in and were a late goal in regulation away from coming away with a huge win in that game. So you see the identity of this team as a team that is able to really lean on their goaltending, and they did that a ton at points throughout the year here as well. So that was another one of the positives from the season as well. And let's not forget those trade deadline acquisitions that all paid some good dividends for this team. You had Ryan Reeves early in the season, and he has become just a fixture on this team, and a fourth line that has played some very, very good hockey here over the last couple of months. He's been a fixture in that spot. You also have the acquisitions of Gustav Nyquist, Marcus Johansson as well, turning that second line into an absolute monster when he was inserted into the lineup. So some great moves to just add some depth to this roster and to accentuate what we already had. And all in all, it leads to a season in which, it's gonna be tough come postseason time in a couple of days. It's gonna be a tough matchup against Dallas in that first round, but the Wilds have a style if they play it. If they can do that and can limit the mistakes, they could be a problem against the Dallas Stars here in this first round series. We've got a ton coming up, so the everydayers will hear a ton of postseason coverage come next week. Full 5-person playoff preview panel coming up for you on Monday. We recorded a great crossover episode with Dane Lewis of Locked On Stars to get some intel on the Dallas Stars. We'll be talking with Kevin Gorg as well. We got a full plate of postseason coverage for you here on Locked On Wild. To finish the show today, we're going to look at some of the things that we learned in this season, and we'll discuss those right after this here on Locked On Wild. Final segment of today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day and part of your daily routine. Seth Topol just finishing up today's episode, talking about some of the things that we learned here this season. And obviously, one of the things, we'll touch on this more next week as well, is that there are a lot of complementary players on this team, especially from an offensive perspective. There are a lot of guys that are supplemental in their play and their playmaking. This team is going to need a couple of guys that can really command and take charge. Yes, the Wild did end up trading one of those guys to the Los Angeles Kings, but in this next wave of this core, that's going to be, I think, a big thing for this team to try to find is more of those types of guys that can step up and take charge, be the guy, be the one taking the shots. It's at this point, it's Kirill Kaprizov, and Matt Boldy has shown that he's been able to do it when he has been asked to be that guy. Now, if he can be that guy without kind of having to flip that switch, then that's going to be a good thing for this team going forward as well. We also learned this season that despite the lack of goals, that all those other pieces that the Wild did not have last year in terms of better defense, better goaltending, better special teams, they go through some waves. A few weeks ago even, we're talking about how this team was a top 10 in both penalty kill and power play. And the power play fell off. But again, that is because there's not a lot of players that are the take charge play drivers. And so for this team heading into the postseason, if we could get one other guy to step up and help drive things on that power play, then I think this team would be able to take it to a really good throughout the postseason. And the big thing with the Wilds that will be a story here as the postseason starts is that we learned that when this team plays a smart style of hockey and they do all of the little things that contribute to wins, that they can beat just about anybody in the NHL. It shows you how difficult it is to do that, to really commit to blocking shots, to battling for the puck on the boards. When this team does that consistently, gets everybody to do it, and does it for a full 60 minutes, they're capable of going to New Jersey and beating the Devils. They're capable of playing with the Maple Leafs in Toronto. They're capable of jumping out to what probably should have been a 2-0 lead against the Boston Bruins at XL Energy Center before those goals were waved off the board. And the biggest thing that I'm holding out hope for, I'm showing my hand a little bit with our postseason coverage, but looking at some of the practice reports from the lines that the Wild utilized in their morning skate here today ahead of Monday's start to the postseason against Dallas, willing to learn from previous mistakes. Folks, that third line D pairing for the Minnesota Wilds is not necessarily who you would expect. Brock Faber was skating with John Klingberg on that third pairing for the Minnesota Wild. if Faber ends up starting and if Filip Gustavsson ends up starting in game 1, then we're seeing some learning from the coaching staff as to some of the things that let them down against the St. Louis Blues last year, and even going back to the series against the Vegas Golden Knights 2 years ago in the postseason is, yeah, you may have a particular lineup that you used that got you to this point. That doesn't mean that that has to be the lineup that you use going into the postseason. John Merrill played a ton in the regular season. What did St. Louis do in the postseason last year? Anytime they got the opportunity to get that third line, anytime the Wild put that third line D pairing out on the ice last year of John Merrill and Dmitry Kulikov, the St. Louis Blues tried to exploit it every single time. Every single time they were out there. And so, yeah, even as early as a few weeks ago, you'd probably expect that John Merrill would be out there. And that's not to say he may very well end up being out there. But the fact that Brock Faber could come in, play for 2 games, and make enough of an impact on the roster to get the coaching staff's attention to where he took that starting spot in warmups, that's an encouraging sign as to the desire to not repeat last postseason's mistakes, where we got sucked into that one lineup, and before it was too late, we saw some changes, but that was in like game 6. So I think we're seeing that this team as well has hopefully learned from last year's postseason failure and is not eager to repeat that same thing. And it may be that the Wild end up losing in the series against the Stars. Dallas is not going to be an easy team to go up against. Fantastic goalie. They have a dominant offense with probably the best line in hockey, but a ton of other guys that can beat you beyond that. And so it may be that it just is too much for the Minnesota Wild to deal with here in this postseason, but I don't get the sense that the Wild are going to go down without a fight. And the big overall arcing theme going back to the start of the season is that the formula that the Wild had last year did not work, and it was not going to work this year. In order for the Wild to have postseason success, they were going to need to be good in all of those other areas. And so we head into this postseason a different looking team that plays differently. And I think that will give the Wild a better chance in this postseason than it did in the last postseason. So it was a ride of a regular season, to say the least, but it's all over now. And postseason starts up on Monday. So enjoy the quiet calm before the storm. Postseason begins Monday, and we will have you covered every single step of the way here at Locked On Wild. That will do it for today's episode. So now make sure that you take this opportunity to make the Locked On NHL podcast your second listen today to get a full lowdown on all of the postseason matchups heading into the playoffs next week. Locked On NHL is available on all of your favorite podcast platforms, absolutely free of charge, as is Locked On Wild. So make sure you subscribe and follow along with us so that you don't miss out on any of our playoff preview coverage. We have 4 episodes coming up for you on Monday. Yes, 4 episodes coming up for you on Monday, and they will not be overlaps. We have a ton of different angles to break down for Monday's season playoff opener. So make sure to follow along with us every step of the way. You can find Locked On Wild on your favorite podcast platforms, on YouTube, on social media as well. So join us as we keep you covered with new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.